Well, here we are, a beautiful summer day. I'm about to embark on a something I'm not sure I can even begin to truly address, but it's been a curious experience. Um, Let me thank uh, Benjamin C. for that recurring donation. Love your hanging in there, Benjamin, and keeping those recurring ones coming. Recurring sounds funny, much like a headache, but believe me, in our case, it's not a headache. It's a real help. So thank you for that donation. Thank you all for all your commenting, sharing, and all the subscribing that's grown us up to this level. A number I didn't expect much to run into, and I'm very pleased, especially to whatever benefit, to whatever extent we're having, uh, good effects with people. Today's conversation, though, I mean, whoa. Now, in some ways, I don't even know if I can address this. So I say that meaning it's taken a whole serious reconvening with myself and my experience. There's so many of these moments I'm in the middle of a conversation with a student, I can say, yeah, that was a breakthrough for me. That was a breakthrough for me. But it's sit here and make a list, all these major shifts. Well, let's see what it says. So we call it search for best practices. But, the best practices model is, what is that? Some of it has to do with having seen great paintings and desiring certain things for whatever reason. Some of it is just making yourself a more efficient painter, getting not taking so long on pictures. And best practices, bringing the qualities you want for the purpose, so on. I wish Blake were here to follow up as I go along with this, but I'm just going to read his statement here, and I'm going to allow that my face will be on part of the screen, I'm hoping, Mr. Producer. Thank you for your patience with this, too. I hope it doesn't go for a full hour, but the chances are, especially the way I'm wandering around here now, it will. Can you talk more about your history discovering best practices? Now, I've cut some of your stuff out of here. Understand that, Blake, to shorten this up. But discovering best practices, as I understand it, you learned of the Boston School methods from Gamble, but his sharing of it was incomplete, was heavily influenced by Paxton as a student. And that's me saying that Paxton wasn't exactly doing what I found to be the rest of the Boston School, which is really by definition the Boston School. By the way, the Boston School is Gamble's term, and I don't even want much to be this guy who's stealing the term from him and applying it to my guys. Gamble was broadening the thing out enough to include Paxton, whose methods are different from Benson, Tarbell, and DeCamp. And for that reason, though, if the method is the school, Paxton's different. But if Gamble wanted to be broad enough for the range of their ways of working to be allowed for, that's up to him. I buy into the idea that the method is the school, and just what Gamble said. Nothing more or less than that. And therefore, the difference is real for me. But what I'm really talking about is just what I've learned through these guys to create better efficiencies and helping me to get more to what I like and what I'm finding in for example, the visual impression, what I'm finding and want to access. And so best practices for that purpose, right? There's also a search for best practices for doing imaginative painting and that sort of thing. So, and they're not precisely the same. As a student, being handed down best practices directly from you, Blake is speaking now, how can I avoid failing to learn the ability to find it myself? Now, that's a really important question, isn't it? That idea that you're all of it's self-teaching. You can't counterfeit the experience. You have to have the experience. So in one sense, nothing to worry about. You're not going to make it to the next level by trying to just simply do what somebody else says and think that you're going to be able to live in that world, in that practice. Now you can. I get the sense that Flandrin was somewhat like that he was a student of Ang and looks like he was trying to live in a Ang world. Now, I don't mean to say it's literally like Ang, but it feels like just it's a bit of a clone thing. And who doesn't, if you're working with somebody, isn't there a certain amount of cloning necessary for you just to begin to understand what it is? But the search for best practices requires you to find your own reason to be, right? And that's going to be the key to this as you go along. So like a family that might have its wealth in one generation versus another that's able to maintain wealth, expertise, vision, purpose over many generations. Now, I'm not, we are talking about maintaining qualities, right? I mean, look at painting, look at the history of painting and notice those things which are what brought you to the dance. And yeah, there's going to be a body of that stuff that you want to maintain just because it's what you love. And it's in one sense who you are. But our goal isn't to simply get a bunch of stuff and collect it for people or collect it even for ourselves. Our job is to be honest to ourselves and say, no, it has to come through me. It has to be me standing in the way of all these other guys, and even you might say correcting the Michelangelos, the Leonardos. Correcting them to what? Well, to greater clarity about the very nature of this form, among other things. So best practices have changed over time, and but the best practices for what? So this is so much up to you that in one sense you don't have any choice but to self-apply, to self-investigate. But learn stuff from people and keep thinking it through with more information, with more information, with more information. I'll show you how that's worked for me. I'm sure you'll find a way to answer this question best, but here are some ideas. Chronological retelling of your development as a painter, things you did, reading, painting, copies, finding teachers, community, specific paintings or texts that triggered major shifts in your development. Something like 5 rules for becoming a painter. Well, I doubt that I would be very close to any of that stuff, but I can give you some sort of a chronological retelling minimally, okay? And so I'm going to go to pictures, but I will say this, that the search for a painter is this huge thing. For a teacher, I mean, is a huge thing. And I remember being that guy in many, many, many places where I couldn't settle in because, no, this just wasn't it. This just wasn't it. Even at the Art Students League, there were aspects of it that just wasn't it. It just wasn't it, despite working with multiple people at the Art Students League. And it doesn't mean I didn't learn from these guys in different ways, some of which I'll probably talk about. But that search for a teacher is a big deal. And one of the things I'm enjoying about the people that are coming to see me now is that they have a clearer idea because of my videos, who I am as a teacher. So when they get here, they're not surprised. And then saying, well, that's not really what I wanted. And I'm going to, the chicken who hatched a duck model probably is less likely to be a thing. Not that there won't always be that thing, because we're all variations. So things I did, reading, painting, that's what we'll talk about. And I can't give you 5 rules. I don't think I can give you 5 rules for becoming a painter, but I'm going to think about that one as a totally different video sometime. Anyway, Blake, wish you were here. All right, let's go on with the images. Now, the first thing isn't, one of the earliest guys I studied with said, don't read books, just look at the pictures. And I have found that's probably the one piece of bad advice that guy gave. He gave some other advice that was very good. But just as a beginning point, I mean, Gamel's book, The Twilight of Painting, gives so much background in terms of where we are today. That's a huge book to have read. Eventually, you'll read Dennis Miller Bunker, Gamel's interpretation of, which it takes you further into the thinking that was surrounding the era at the time Gamel was, shall we say, coming out of. He was proceeding from. And if you work with Gamel and the Boston School guys, Jan Vermeer of Delft and Velasquez are both books, and Sargent as well. All 3 of them are books that will introduce you to this new way of thinking about what this whole thing is, that gets us out of the academic world and moves us along to so we just call it the evolution of painting. So I found that every one of these books had stuff in it that applies broadly and specifically. The one thing I found, though, in digging up is the Gamel was right about one thing: find out what painters have said. So I would go through these books looking for quotes. The Millet book by Julia Cartwright, she's really excerpted the best quotes out of the material that's available. I mean, it's remarkable what she's done, given that she isn't a painter. but everybody should have read the Reynolds discourses, Ang's. And by the way, you think you can't apply them, but someday they'll apply themselves to you. But you read them with an ear, and things rather have always grabbed me, and probably because of my orientation, they've grabbed me and stuck with me more than I've said, oh, I got to remember that. I've got to remember that. Very interesting. And so, but my reading wasn't a sort of a left to right reading in the first place. I was in a search mode. So I was like I say sometimes to you guys, when I was a kid, we would see the tailings on the side of a hill in Colorado where the mining had been going on. There was this big pile of white rocks down below a hole in the sort of a mine shaft. And you sort of wonder at those things. Of course, they were looking for gold. And there's a lot you have to wade through to find the golden quotes. And then there's this whole thing of experience. If you're not a painter for all this time, these are the things you learn, that if you're not painting and painting and painting, you don't know what the heck these things really mean in practice. And that really is the key to all painting. You learn, right? You pick that up. You gradually pick that up. So among other things, Impressions on Painting by Stebbins is one of those books that has no end of wealth. Ang looks like it ought to apply just to, Ang by the Walter Pock book is a very nice one to read. Some excellent quotes in it. And then all the other ones, Gamel's Ang by Amari Duvall and all those guys. Ang is full of quotes that apply to everything any impressionist will do. And if you understand how to apply it. So on it goes. I didn't mention Leonardo's book that comes up a little bit. The Treatise on Painting is a huge breakthrough thing. So let me just mention some stuff. If we're just talking about going to the museum, this is a huge body of your practice. You need to have been in museums. You need to look at a lot of pictures. I was in and out of museums constantly. I was very fortunate to be within range of walking distance of museums the whole time I've been studying. And I was in them all the time. I mean, this is part of that search for best practices. And so that was a major thing to be able to. Now, I would go in there with the theories about painting and composition and stuff. And eventually you'll go in there with a question in mind, and you'll begin looking at pictures. And that question might be about composition. It might be about edge handling. If you're looking at Zorn, it might be about, look what he's doing. He's painting. This is not what painting used to be. That Velasquez on the left, the sort of the more academic model. Well, that was something I found at the, and gave me an insight about the flatness. We were told to paint flat. And I saw this Velasquez. It was not like flat, but thin, so this model of thick over thin. And I that was a breakthrough. I began to apply that. The two paintings on the right, though, where the application was much more about the visual order, painting in the visual order. So these are in that class of breakthroughs. But being in the museum is a huge thing. Don't overlook it. The guys you're working with, the guys around me, the paintings of Robert Douglas Hunter, the still lifes, and Gamel's own work. This one on the left was right in front of me when I got in the studio, or he's working on it. He's finishing it up, I think, as I spent my time with him. And what I'm showing you mine for, what the bottom is, that you can see it isn't precisely either of these things. But they're lessons from all these different experiences that come to bear. But I'm just saying, the guys immediately around you, pay attention. I'm going to show you Daniel Green on the left. Numbers of things from Daniel Green. One of them was just the fact of his organization. It was a big breakthrough for me to see that he organized, as it were, rather scientifically, and spoke about the organization of middle tones, or the most chromatic note on a piece of skin, and that sort of thing, and where it would be and why it would be there and all that sort of thing. Some of the stuff I learned was, you might call it negative. I mean, I learned not to do construction drawing because I found it so unpleasant, so inherently rather ugly. And it didn't fit the great lines. So to have been in that class and to have made a determination of what not to do was a big thing for me. But the mark making of Daniel Green had an aesthetic quality to itself, just a certain fluidity of touch in his hand and that sort of thing. Those kinds of things you pick up from people. I definitely picked that up in that moment. But at one point, Daniel Green had a drawing and I've mentioned it to you before, but he had a line contour of a face, and it was a beautifully made line and a nicely rendered impression. And I said, why don't you draw like this? because he was drawing construction drawing, like the Brackman stuff here. Underlying these paintings is construction drawing stuff and angles and stuff. I wish I had some of those other pictures to show you from that era, but you know, it was just because of my observing so much of the world, the history of painting, and seeing that drawing was actually the interpretation of line and extended continuous line that you saw. So like Alfred Stevens would say, and by the way, the quotes are just huge. There's no end to the pure quotes. And it's life-changing. I mean, it's experience changing. It helps you to, rather, as it were, in some ways, interpret nature. At least it gives you an insight from somebody who was there doing it himself, the same game as you were in the same moment. But the idea of Sargent, for example, saying, draw the longest line you can, well, that isn't the same model as, and so these words are with me, but it's not the same model as going hacking your way around. And that word, I can't get a better word because there's just something about this inelegance of this way of working that's, and the fact is, what I was going to say about Stevens is he says, bring, I'm sorry, I don't have this quote right in front of me, but he says, bring the truth right to the front, right now, right at the beginning, bring it right up. There's something about doing that is so, you know, you learn that, but you learn it partly in this experience by not what you're just finding. You're finding a distraction and an unattraction too. I don't know why that treatise on painting is there. Oh, I do know why. So at the Art Students League, the difference between these two. So this is a big moment, you might say. But here I am at the Art Students League just painting like Monet, but there was a massive breakthrough, and I'm sorry this isn't a better reproduction because this is where I learned to get a quality of a flatness of the wall. We were into broken color and everything even the walls looked like they were mottled. And so I realized that I actually valued the tactile sense of the wall, this long smoothness of the wall. Now, I didn't bring that at this point to the figure. I was still in broken, and this is who knows, we probably had some issues with the pose or something like that. This doesn't appear to have been huge numbers of hours in the painting. But so that was a breakthrough out of brokenness. And I tried many ways to get myself to have those kinds of, the walls of the Art Students, they were long and flat and gray and sometimes shiny. And in a certain kind of light, they were nicely colored too. And so I was just this guy who's just looking and wanting what I saw. And sometimes it was a flat, continuous, beautiful wall form, shall we say. But the Art Student, it was a big break to get, and this is where I'm going to talk some more, but to get from the figure this way, a big leap. And I had to walk through the Boston School of Thinking, not so much by words now, as much as by example. And I'll show you some starts that are major breakthroughs for me. I began to literally look for best practices. Like when you're starting a picture, what do you do first? What do you do second? What do you do third? Now, I knew that some guys drew outlines of objects and modeled them up. But in the search, and I had done some of that, but not as much here as what I eventually did with Gamel. This is actually a step past Gamel. So you go here, then there's this whole academic drawing period with Gamel, and then there's this opening out for best practices, which then can incorporate some of the previous knowledge and et cetera, et cetera. So all the experiences were necessary. As I said, the students that came to see me at the Art Students League asked me if I'd seen the line of shadow. At this point, I'm sure I had no idea of the line of shadow. And over here, it's much more evident that I'm aware of the specificity of the line of shadow. But that wasn't anything anybody ever mentioned. And if you're having a teacher who's telling you not to read, you wouldn't have read Leonardo on painting. And you would have missed very many important things, like the idea of Fumato, the soft smoke-like gradations in the middle tones. You know, that idea is a huge visual awareness moment, right? So once I started reading, those were two things that were big breakthroughs for me. You know, I've talked about all this stuff in pieces in the past, so maybe this is a value in itself, even though, so don't be too upset with me running us right through it again. This is me with Gamel he's got me going from the cast to a cast painting. This was what I was telling you about, I think, at one point where he said, he came in and saw it, and he said, I didn't mean for you to do it in color. So he was trying to actually get me to do a black and white cast painting, but he didn't say that, and somehow or other the words didn't get across to me that we're doing what you might call a grisaille. So I just was exploring the color of this, the wild, nuanced craziness of the color of this interesting cast. Is this Nikolai? I'm trying to think who this guy is. Huh. An interesting, Gamma would always, by the way, try to get you to name whoever the sculptor was and know the name of the work itself. I wasn't particularly fond of doing that, I must say, and I'm not happy about that. And some of them I happen to know the names, some not so much. But I go from doing this outline-based shadow line, turning of the shadow line and all that sort of stuff and trying to somehow or other figure out how to incorporate the big forms and to get all the little ones in there, to a very different model. This is the attempt to find best practices without paint. So this is the attempt to do visual order painting. But this was more than anything an attempt to not make the painting not have 40 things wrong with it at the end of a half hour. So, but that's one of the things that led me to best practices. And so that's a breakthrough. And I think that's also mentioned by Schmid, that he was finding himself with all these errors. What the heck? So what was he doing in the meantime? And that's part of the search for best practices. So this was a major breakthrough where I calmed myself down and said, how about you make a drawing in which you don't have to go back and fix 40 things? And that brought me to my attention to how poorly I was working with the stuff I was immediately putting down. In any case, this is sorry about this, was done as a demonstration, and it's just now a piece of trash. It's been laying around the studio getting battered and beaten. But it gives an idea of a nuanced version of this. This is just early on. But it's to do a cast drawing, not in the old school way of drawing the outline, massing the flat shadow and cutting the shadow line and then turning it. But it was a unified process. And that was a big deal because I realized I needed a unified process to do this well. If I wanted to know where this was, it couldn't look like a phony cutout. It had to look, the form had to be on it to have it play right to this over here. Some of that stuff, these are major things, shifts that stick with you forever. This is just me being outdoors with pencil. Now I can say, so here I'm painting a cast in paint, here's a charcoal, and this is pencil, sort of mass painting with a pencil. This is very tiny. This one here is probably, the figure itself in this is probably maybe 10 inches high. I don't know if it's that tall. I don't think it's 12. And, but this drawing here is probably 3 inches high, giving you some idea. But the application of information from the treatise in painting was huge for me. It was in my awareness. It was the earliest things that Gamma recommended. He said, he gave me the book by McCurdy, which is the Notebooks of the God, contains everything. And it gets into so much junk, and you finally realize, you got to read all this stuff about, the reproductive organs. You're going to read about, so I just started isolating the treatise on painting. Finally, I found one just called the Treatise on Painting. Now, this is my introduction to form. I was a sculpture student. As a high school kid, I was able to spend hours and hours a day for 2 years just doing my own thing, more or less. And I was sculpting. I wish I could have been doing it from life, but I was sculpting the human figure. And that feeling for form, though, is a major thing for you to break through and begin to articulate that sense of form. But so my models were primarily, Degas, Millet, and Michelangelo, and of course, the Belvedere torso, Michelangelo is one of his great inspirations. So, and which you can see is apparent in this sort of thing here. But the idea of the management of middle tones and the idea of expression of great form. Well, it's a name. You have to come up with the idea of what is form. So you can see when we're talking about form, a painting as a form. It says this is the art of color. That's the form. When you're talking about form and you mean the creation of the sense of depth, as Degas would say it, that's a thing that you want to acquire. You want to be good at it. And at that point, and this point here, at some point here, now I had a certain feeling for it right away in drawing the figure anytime because I'd been sculpting. And I was sculpting a little bit at the Art Students League at the time, although I wasn't much happy with what was available there. So, but it was in copying drawings. Like I believe this one is The Fog. And in copying drawings like this, you get the sense of how painters did it. And this is just me showing you various papers. I tried at some point, this is a charcoal drawing, this is a pencil drawing from life. This is Mr. Producer, by the way. I said, what were you, Mr. Producer, in your 20s there? And and this is, but this is a charcoal, it might be black chalk and white chalk on toned paper. So these are experiments that I did, and these are very significant breakthroughs when you're trying to find your way in drawing. You don't feel obliged to stick with one medium. I woke up to that then. Now, one of the things I'd been very, very interested in the past in whether our way of working was to draw an outline and model it up. So this was all organized around the big shape, the shadow line, masking shadow flat, and eventually finding things like reflected lights, but finding the form and then modeling the form up in this Fumato, the smoky kind of way. Well, when I got to, when I was looking around, well, and the discussion of lines always there. And one thing I mentioned here, the fineness version and the finesse idea. The beauty of this Lillian Westcott Hale is, it's the use of charcoal that's spectacular. And she had a wonderful background in decorative work and a feeling for beauty long before. She didn't have quite the same concern. I don't mean she wasn't inaccurate, but she wasn't dominated, as we so often were as young guys, with this idea of the likeness, as much as she was also fully invested in the idea of beauty. Of course, she wasn't a young child when she did these pictures either. She was an experienced painter. And she was one of the students of the museum school, the Tarbell and those guys, as well as being out of some other backgrounds in Long Island, I think, New York. But the line quality, and by the way, some of you guys have seen me drawing a line diagonally, and some of you have critiqued me for doing it. It's just the fact is it's an easy way to cover the territory. It gives you a unified treatment that is not inelegant. So that's a thing that many, many people, including different people have borrowed from Leonardo. It's one of his traits that has a certain quality of beauty that shows that these guys are into beauty in every mark. The quality of the line, the quality of, I don't know if this is a silver point or what it is, probably is. But when I got to Fetchin, I actually found I liked something, and like he'd taken some lessons, right? Same thing, a really fine point. But what was interesting about him is his breadth of modeling, and then he would come back to the line, and so that was a thing where I got to see line into modeling, and vice versa, right? And so there's something about that. Now, that was a big shift because it changed everything. Lots of things in painting. I thought, at this point now, all of a sudden, I don't have to draw outlines. I can actually model up great movements and find the drawing afterwards. And this is a huge breakthrough when you get there. And this was where it began. He broke that out for me, looking at Fetchin's drawings. Nikolai Fetchin, Russian trained. Now, memory painting gave me tons of confidence. So that was a major thing, and I picked that up under Gamel, and but frequently you don't know what the benefits are till years later, memory training. But what we're doing when we're drawing is we're learning something, and with something visual. So visual training, you're memorizing what you see and the way it looks, and it begins to be this huge value to you later. You realize that's all you do now. You don't memorize ideas about things. That'd be like construction memory or something like that. Or underlying ideas about things. We don't do that. We've learned to use our visual memory. So the things we see per se, it was a big breakthrough, and it gives you it gave me massive confidence. Now this is the rest of this I might be able to go faster with, but one of the things, this one on the left I'm showing you is because I was doing a professional portrait and I was not doing well. And so I hired a model, and I said, "Is this me? Should I just not be out there? I'm not prepared yet, or is this the model?" And so that's a big thing when you go and hire a model, and you say, "Now sit," and then you pose the model, and then in a matter of 9 hours, you have a portrait like that one on the left. So that was a major breakthrough to me to realize how often it's nature itself. The model itself moving, or even having attitudes, or coming in with, I had one model come in with different skin colors, bases from time to time when I didn't know what the heck that was. And but that's one of those moments that's huge in the building of your confidence. You say, I can do this. That's not an obstacle. That was as good a portrait as had done up to that point. But the next two, though, are actually a search for best practices. And now I'll talk more about this in a second, about how I got from where I was going after the great color schemes and the great form and all the great aspects of the impression, even if I was going to finish like this. And so this is a pastel that's essentially done this way. In pastels, you don't have quite the same liberty, but it's not that different. This is not a carefully made drawing beforehand, even though it has all these very articulated and high contrast contours. But those are the ones. The two on the right just are something that's a longer term breakthrough that came partly out of the copying I did. I mean, one of the things I did with both of these works here, I made copies for people, and copying is a huge thing, and I found it to be, again, it was very much planting your feet in what painters can do and what their hands have made. And it's very different when you see paintings and photographs online, you're not getting the same information. So have that in mind. But that's one of those things you learn, that you must look at paintings, ideas about painting. Now, things about paintings you can see, like their compositions, but when it comes down, and that's why I can teach a composition class online. But when it comes down to the articulation and the handling of paint, the way paint is used, and the kinds of thickness of canvases, etc., you have to see things in person. But so there were two things that happened here. One is that in copying this Paxton, I copied it the Boston School way, not the Paxton way. And I say that meaning I blurred my eyes and just worked in the visual order. And so these things, the start of this Paxton this copy would have been more like the tarbell you're about to see in a second. So that was a big breakthrough because my point in searching for best practices was, can I find a practice that's efficient, which I found the Boston School way to be, at getting me the major stuff, the great color, the great visual order stuff, and end with as much detail as I want without losing those qualities. And so this was a great moment in which to practice that. And of course, it was just done from an actual, from the painting. Now, the one on the left actually was doing the same thing exactly, and this is a different painter. And I found that his thinking is essentially the same as the Boston School. It's the visual order thinking, very impression-based thinking, but visual order thinking. And I found the practice was exactly the same, that the most essential, the most powerful, important areas of a painting are established first and most dominantly, and you can very quickly see your composition. It was a big deal. It was a big deal, a big breakthrough. I copied this one on the left, the Bouguereau, because I wanted to understand what he was doing, whether he was glazing, number one, and what palette he was using. And I found that basically the palette I had would do that. At the time, it was still something of an earth tone palette still, meaning I was using Venetian red and Indian red, some of those, the Gamel's palette. And the way of handling the paint, I found that I could do everything I did with direct paint just by using softer brushes. I didn't need to invest in any kind of glazing experience. I didn't find that there was anything. But that's the huge thing you can do when you have and this painting was right in front of me. It wasn't like I was copying from a photograph. And right in front of you, if you can match everything about the way it's made, you can learn so much about a painting. So this is when I stopped worrying about what these guys like Bouguereau were doing and began to just live in the world of, that I have and find, maybe a better palette. Now, the one on the left was all about touch. I was just not frustrated with my drawings, and I wanted to find a drawing that I had access to that showed some qualities of mark making that had some aesthetic quality to it. And I'd say this isn't that one, but in many ways it is, and certain passages are very much like that. So I copied this thing, and by the time I was halfway into it, I felt like I had Raphael's hand. I could make marks that looked exactly like his, and I knew how the hand would feel when making these marks. Those are big deal breakthroughs. And I even find a painting today that the tactile side of things is a big deal. So this is a very rough canvas here, and there are certain marks you can make with such and such a brush that are best done by feel. Now, it's true at the end it's got to look right too, but that feel really helps you to make that mark. It adds to the effectiveness of your mark making. Now, I can talk about composition breakthroughs. Gamel talked right early on, I picked this up quickly from the idea of pattern, and what he meant was things like this, just the pattern of this thing, this interesting abstraction of cutout. Pattern in the sense of, if you cut out the pattern of a dress, that pattern. And so I was early on doing that. Within 2 or 3 paintings with Gamel, I was, and I had nothing else to work with, so I worked with what he gave me, at least what he seemed to be suggesting. And of course, part of that was based on looking at his own work. So this was a big breakthrough, the idea of pattern. But it was my introduction to certain aspects of a composition. I'm pretty sure he was talking about centers of interest and things like that, but those things have gotten past me. I can't recall what he said. Mostly he would just come in if you were working on something, and he would just move something a little further over, and just to improve your painting a little bit. And then he'd say, go ahead and make it. And this one, he just came in and laughed and said, go for it. Now, the basics of composition, though, that's the experience of two things: looking at their work and listening to their words. And so I had the words of, well, in the case of the one before, this is Ang said, look at the Greek vases. So that was a big deal. What for? Well, this is what was most evident, is the fascination of the shape making. And of course you can talk about Ang as being this line guy, but the informative line, the interesting line, all that stuff that has, to do with the intrigue of a pictorial unit, what happens in a frame. So that was Ang talking. And I give this stuff in my composition class to you in a very extended way, but online class. But here's Jerome talking. He says every picture has a main line and most a secondary line. I call it a counter line, but so that's the discussion about main line. And I invested. These are major breakthroughs when you hear something like that, and then you work it out. And this is the biggest thing about everything you learn. You kind of work it out to see if and how it's true. But that can't be done except in practice. The middle one is Benson, and this whole conversation about spotting. I would never heard anything about that except from the Boston School. And of course, Gamel was that conversation significantly. But read the Benson advice, and which I offer people if you want to understand more about Benson's thinking in general about painting. But Benson was also the guy that introduced me with words to something I'd already figured out by looking at their starts, which is the visual order approach to painting. Degas, he's this guy that introduces to you the idea of painting as music. And so the idea of repetition, the idea of a play of a shape, slightly shifting and then shifting again, the three of them getting coordinated into something overall just fascinating. Color schemes, overall color schemes. Degas is he's like a lesson in composition. Major breakthrough to find that in Degas. Some of this comes, by the way, from my teaching. When you share with other people, you're forced to think things through in a better way and to question yourself and even go home and wonder how what you said how precisely it's true. Because you can say things, believe things, and yet not have as much clarity as you need. It's, one of the big breakthroughs for me was finding good thinking. And Gamel would say, you have to learn to think things through. Now, I can't tell you what exact moment some of these things happened, except when I'm looking at a picture and all of a sudden I remember. That's what happened. That's what makes this a difficult video. But that got me into the process of reading books on thinking and reading books on logic and problem solving, and that one thing leading to another. So here, Frank Benson's advice on painting. So this is me coming out of the Gamel background, moving down. And so here we do preliminary brown paper studies, which I probably did for this one. I'm quite sure I did. I even did color studies for this one in pastel, little tiny ones. And then this was the process. This was the ambition to do a Paxton, essentially a Paxton picture. At this point, I was exploring Boston School stuff. I had these two mannequins in that background screen, mannequins, whatever they are, the temple guards from the east somewhere, look Japanese. But these screens, and they were things that had belonged to Boston School guys, so I just used them and made a picture just because I wanted to do it. And I just use this as a chance to process the visual order as much as I understood it at that time. Still, I don't think I'd been involved in the best practices thing yet at all. But you can see this is a shift. Now, you could say that's more like Gamel would probably say that's more like a sketch modality, a sketch model. But this was also before I'd done those copies. So you can see that I was wanting to make sure that I didn't lose the ability to end a picture like this. But that search for best practices had me processing this way. Again, read Benson's advice on painting. But then looking at the starts was a massive big deal. And I'm just showing you this one on the left of Tarbell's to show you that this isn't done from outlines of objects and from careful object drawing. It's done with the idea of articulating values to produce light effects and painting things that are prominent and significant by effect before other things, and yet getting the canvas covered. And I would say typically in that first day, getting the canvas covered. So I demonstrated, this is a demonstration. So, Jazz, you said once that you couldn't understand what the picture was. It isn't important that you understand what the picture is, but it is important to understand what it does and whether it's pleasing, whether it's enjoyable to look at in the abstract. But this was a painting that had, or there's a board that had a painting taped off on one side, another brown study for a mural, and then a board back, or maybe a canvas with some drapery hanging out of it. And this was a yellow baby carriage with drapery hanging out of this, all this gauzy stuff that wouldn't break the carriage down, in the corner of a bench. So if you want to know what it is, but best practices here is the search for color. And this is where I'm agreeing again with Stebbins that we want to make it as like as we can the first time. That's the Bonnat rule, but Stebbins says it, that people bring it right at the beginning. And that model is what I try to get across to people. I learned that it's important to do that you can do it, and you need to do it right from the beginning. So that includes the line, the fineness of line, whether it's important to make it by the end of a start in these places like this, but the whole drawing, the placement of everything, getting the angles right to each other, the edge relationships right of everything you draw. But learning to draw from the salient, from the most significant, and of course keeping your eyes blurred to understand what that is, is such a huge thing. And that's what they're reinforced by the experience of reading, of listening to Meldrum. That's a very good one. But reinforced by that, this idea that a picture looks good in the dark is one of those things Millet and Ang and others talk about. So the one on the bottom right, though, is back to that era when I was like in the one just before, the one on the right, where I was trying to sort out a way of getting through a painting. So in a sense, it was a sketch model. And in fact, this is a preliminary study for a painting of a figure. I was trying to decide what pose to use. And I did 2 or 3 of these, trying to find a nice pose, sometimes with different models, that I was going to then turn into something bigger. But even in this moment here, what you see me is trying to get the color scheme and a good design right from the start. And all this stuff is after Gamel and trying to put everything back together again to find best practices. Remember, the best practices model you're going to have is going to be a combination of the best things you've learned, best for the values that you've found. And you have to put a lot of time, you have to put a lot of time into finding the values, what do you value? And so if you, for example, if you value a painting that looks wet into wet instead of looking like outlines, this one on the right is by Kenyon Cox. This is what I call the Paxton version of Impressionism. It's drawn objects that are colored up with the colors that are true. But you can see it's a different model, and you can see why the Boston School guys are articulating significant players and staying away from all the other stuff and not trying to get the drawings where you come in with the physical drawing of the figure. These people don't come in with that physical drawing. So this is one of those points where you actually, looking at pictures, you see, oh yeah, this gives greater clarity to what I do. I don't do this, I do this. But seeing that, again, these are just breakthroughs. I don't think this is even beginning to be helpful to you. but I'm going to stop at that. And Blake, all I want you to do is get back to me on this, but since you're not here today to respond and get me to give you more feedback. And I haven't gotten to an hour yet. The mercy is on my part. I have tried to get this moved through as quickly as possible. I'll go back just once, though, to the beginning and just look at the statement again. And we'll see whether I could do one more thing. Here again, I'm going to write Mr. Producer. I'm going to put you in the position of having going to an hour instead of doing it in 45 minutes. Yeah, So the question that you're really after is how do you maintain the search process of your own personal search? And all I can say, Gamble said about me once that I was too independent. But there's an element of you, you're not useful to the rest of the world if you're not independent, if you don't think for yourself, if you don't use your own reasoning, if you're just a follower and doing something because somebody else did it and that'll get you some standing. You're actually trying to be in the way of the next, if we want to call it that, the next evolution of our form, right? And you want to always be out there. So what you're trying to do now is when you hear somebody say something, you think it through. So when Gamble would say something to me, and it's part of the reason I wound up being on the outs with him at one point, is that he would say something and I would go look at the pictures, look at paintings throughout history, and I would say, but that doesn't comport. I finally did say that once and somebody went and reported it to him. And it didn't end well. But that's always the structure. You're always trying to find out best practices by looking at nature, the masters, and listening to your teacher, and then listening to the words of both, and that whole construct. But so if you follow that, that's the best way for you to find your best practices. Just make sure that you're tied to that framework, right? I like to say there are multiple legs on the stool, you know. One of them is nature, one of them is the teacher in front of you, one of them is everything about history in the past. And if you can figure out some way, and the other one, you know, the other one is, I say nature, but the whole thing is having to go through your common sense, you know. So think for yourself. That's probably the most important answer. Think for yourself, think things through. But to really own it, you have to paint the things you've heard. When you hear me say something, you got to paint till you understand what I said. Don't judge it. Don't be smart and judge it. Paint it until you understand it, okay? And then get clarity if you don't understand it. Try going back to your teacher and saying, did you mean this? Which is what I did with Gamble more than once. But probably that's the best I can do, Blake. And let's see what that does for you. And if anybody else wants to respond to that, this is a very interesting argument that can go on very deep. I mean, discussion that can go on very deep. And here I am at 50 whole minutes. All right, I'm out of here. Thank you again for Benjamin C. for your wonderful recurring contribution. And for everybody out there, thank you for sharing. Don't fail to notice that we are doing a live stream on the 7th, which is a Thursday. I've been saying it's a Sunday. I don't think I said it to you. But it's a Thursday. We're starting at 11. I'm going to make a mention of again in the subscription, so it'll come out. It should come out to you that morning. That we're doing something, and I just look forward to seeing you all there on that day. Let's have some fun. So several of my people that are around me right now are doing that. Also, I want to say that I am in the process of trying to create a studio. I've always rented $35,000 a year to rent spaces for the last 40 years. It's a lot of dollars. I'm finally I'm just making myself, and thank you to these students around me who are willing to help me construct a building. And if any of you guys are inclined to participate in that, the word will be going out, and we'll go out to you guys about ways you can do that. I mean, talking about actually, there's going to be a fundraiser, so I'm going to mention that as well. In any case, thank you for everything. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being there, as Gamma would say. All right, in the next one.